If you and another adult agree to a private contract in a private home, does the state have the right to break into that room and tell you no? Most of us believe in the ultimate power of consent. We believe our bodies are our own. But in 2001, in a quiet manor in Rottenberg, Germany, two men tested that belief to its absolute limit. There was no victim in the traditional sense because the man who was killed had travelled hundreds of miles specifically to be slaughtered. The world knows Armin Meiwes as the Cannibal of Rottenberg, a title that evokes images of a mindless monster. But the truth revealed by this case is far more unsettling because it is far more logical. This wasn't a story of a hunter, it was a story of a service provider and a willing client fulfilling a mutual terminal desire. Today, we go behind the headlines to uncover the simplicity unseen, a case that isn't actually about madness or gore, but about one terrifyingly simple question: is it possible to legally consent to your own destruction? The architecture of the two men. To see the simplicity of the crime, we must first look at the simplicity of the men involved. Armin Meiwes was not a resident of the criminal underworld. He was a polite, unremarkable IT technician. He lived alone in a sprawling 18th century manor, mowed his lawn, and was described by neighbours as helpful. But Meiwes operated under a singular clinical obsession. He viewed physical consumption as the only permanent solution to human abandonment. To him, the people you love eventually leave.
Für mich war es ein heiliger Akt. Und das Sterben insgesamt gehört eben auch zum Leben dazu. Und wenn jemand ihm selbst sterben will, muss man ihm auch diese Möglichkeit geben, diese durchführen zu lassen oder durchzuführen.
Therefore, incorporation, taking someone inside yourself, was the only way to ensure they stayed forever. It wasn't an act of hate, it was a mechanical fix for the problem of loneliness. Then there was Bernd Jürgen Brandes. To the outside world, Brandes was a success, a high-functioning microchip engineer from Berlin, but Brandes harboured a mirrored void. Since his youth, he had fantasized not about power, but about total surrender. He didn't just want to die, he wanted to be used, transformed and absorbed. In the flickering light of an early internet chat room, these two voids found each other. They didn't meet through a trap. Meiwes posted an advertisement on a forum called the Cannibal Cafe. It was as clear as a classified ad for a used car, looking for a well-built young man for slaughter. Brandes replied. They exchanged emails for weeks, discussing the details with the clinical detachment of two people planning a home renovation. There was no coercion, there was no deception. On March 9, 2001, Brandes took a train to Rottenberg. He had settled his affairs and sold his car. He was arriving for an appointment he had spent his whole life waiting for. The Covenant of Flesh. When Brandes stepped off the train, Meiwes was waiting. They looked like two middle-aged friends meeting for a weekend trip, but as they drove toward the manor, they were leaving the jurisdiction of human morality. What followed was documented by Meiwes on a video camera. The footage, which remains locked in a high-security police vault, is described by those who have seen it as surreal. There is no violence in the traditional sense, but only cooperation.
Saß also dann schon im Wagen und hat dann 10 Schlaftabletten gegessen und dann dazu diesen Weak Medi-Night Saft auf Ex getrunken.
Brandes had ingested 10 sleeping pills and half a bottle of schnapps to numb the physical reality of the choice. In the kitchen, the two men engaged in a dialogue that sat at the intersection of a surgery and a suicide. Together they attempted to cook and consume a part of Brandes' own body. It was a botched amateur ritual, but it was done in total agreement. As Brandes drifted into shock in a bathtub, Meiwes sat nearby and read a Star Trek novel, waiting for his guest to reach the point of no return. In the early hours of the morning, in a dedicated room in the attic, Meiwes ended Brandes' life. He then spent hours meticulously disassembling the body, hanging pieces from meat hooks, a process he called the harvest. To Meiwes, this was the realization of a decades-long hunger. He sat down to a meal prepared with care, feeling a sense of peace he had never known. He believed he was finally keeping someone with him forever. To him, the contract was complete. The discovery and the legal deadlock. For over a year, Meiwes lived as if nothing had happened. He worked his job, fixed computers, and lived off the contents of his freezer. But when he returned to the internet to find the second guest, a student in Austria saw the advertisement and alerted the police. When the authorities raided the manor, they didn't find a man hiding in the basement. They found a man who welcomed them in. Meiwes showed them the tape and the remains, confident that because Brandes had wanted this, he hadn't committed a crime. This is where the story gets complicated for the public, but simple for the law. German prosecutors were stuck. You cannot easily charge someone with murder when the deceased left a paper trail begging for the act to happen. In Germany, there is a specific law for Tötung auf Verlangen, which means homicide on request. It is essentially assisted suicide carrying a maximum sentence of only 5 years. For a moment, the legal system was paralyzed. If a person is of sound mind and chooses to be killed, does the state have the right to punish the person who fulfills that wish? The media dubbed him the Master Butcher. But in the courtroom, the defense was logically sound. How can there be a crime when there is no victim? The overlooked simplicity. Here is the click, the truth that most people never consider. The trial of Armin Meiwes wasn't about the act of cannibalism itself, it was about the limit of the individual. In 2004, Meiwes was initially convicted of manslaughter. The public outcry was deafening. But in 2006, a landmark retrial reached a much sharper conclusion. They upgraded the conviction to murder and sentenced him to life in prison. They didn't do this because he was a madman. They did it because they realized a terrifying reality. If the law had accepted this contract, it would mean a human being can legally become property, as long as they agree to it. The court realized they weren't protecting Bernd Brandes, they were protecting the definition of humanity. If consent was enough to justify the harvest, then a human life could be legally treated as a commodity. It would mean that a person could be used up like a piece of equipment or processed like livestock as long as there was a signature on a contract. The legal system decided that your humanity is not yours to sell. They judged Meiwes based on a base motive, ruling that killing for pleasure turns a person into an object. And a society that allows humans to be objects cannot survive. The legacy. Armin Meiwes remains in a prison in Hessen, where he has become an unexpected fixture of the German penal system. He is described by prison staff as a model inmate, polite, highly intelligent, and helpful to others. In an ironic twist that feels almost like a calculated punchline, the man who committed the ultimate act of consumption has reportedly become a vegetarian. But the legacy of the Rottenberg cannibal is best seen in the final legal battle Meiwes fought from behind bars. When a film titled Rottenberg, internationally released as Grim Love, attempted to dramatize his life, Meiwes did something remarkable. He sued to block its release. He argued that the movie violated his personal rights and his right to a fair rehabilitation. It was a final, staggering paradox. The man who had stripped Bernd Brandes of his humanity, his body and his life was now using the high-minded principles of the German constitution to protect his own image. He was demanding that the state protect his dignity against a film crew, even though he had successfully argued that dignity was a commodity he could ignore in the privacy of his own home. This lawsuit reveals the final piece of the equation. Meiwes had once argued that a private agreement placed him beyond the reach of the state. Now, he was invoking the very same state to protect his own rights. The final equation. We like to believe that consent is the ultimate authority. We believe that if two people agree, the rest of the world should stay out of the room. But the case of Armin Meiwes proves that there is a ceiling to our freedom. It leaves us with a logical sequence that most of us are afraid to finish. If consent is absolute, this shouldn't be murder. If this is murder, consent has limits. And if consent has limits, then freedom does too.